Hello and welcome to this presentation on ethics and compassionate conservation. So my job with this presentation is really just to give you a little bit of a sample about what environmental ethics is and really do it through the lens of a kind of emerging idea that's been called compassionate conservation. So the first thing I want to say is that conservation is philosophy and ethics. And I know that we don't commonly think of it that way. We think of it as, as science and practice. But I'm a professor of environmental ethics and philosophy, and I have dedicated my career to doing philosophy really within the realm of conservation. And I see conservation as philosophy and ethics. I see ethics and philosophy everywhere in conservation. Just some examples of that. When we ask basic questions like what ought we to conserve, like what is the object of conservation, or what is worthy of conserving is another way to phrase that, we're asking in part philosophical questions or ethical questions. We use words like ought as it's an ethical word. Or when we try to think about conservation and we ask questions like, is the cost of conserving one species or one thing worth something else, that sort of trade-off? Is it, again, worth something? And how do we compare those things? We're asking, in part, philosophical questions. If we conserve something, can we do it in a just way? So questions about justice and what justice looks like in conservation decision-making are philosophical questions. What does it mean to conserve something? Like, how do we know, in other words, when we've actually done or performed conservation? What does that actually look like? Why? Why should we be interested in conservation in the first place? So not only is conservation rich with philosophical and ethical questions, but you can see from this set of questions that these are pretty core and pretty important to making sense of and doing conservation, certainly doing it well. So when we think about conservation these days, one of the, people propose different approaches to conservation. And one of the recent proposals is to refocus conservation on something that's called compassionate conservation. And so if we want to understand what is compassionate conservation, we want to understand where does that come from? It's a recent proposal. But I think it's also important to understand where it's coming from. Why are people wanting to be focused on this concept of compassion? What does it mean to be focused on this concept of compassion? And I think one of the easiest ways to see what it is to understand just a little bit about ethical theory. And it fits into our story about ethical theory quite nicely. So if we think about ethics is an attempt to answer the question, what should we do? What's the right thing to do? We might use words like good and bad, right and wrong, ought, should. We know that when we're using questions like that, or the form of those questions is also what's underpinning our evaluation of policies. Policies are prescriptions for action. Any kind of prescription for action or evaluation of an action itself is ethical. We're making judgments about whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, and we're going to inevitably be evoking ethical theories in order to do that. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we say something was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, many times, and I would say this is the dominant ethical theory in conservation and in the Western world generally, many times what we do is we say, well, what happens if we do that? If we have this policy, what will the results be? What are the consequences of that policy or those actions? That theory, that approach has a name. It's called consequentialism, that we're evaluating the goodness or badness of a given approach based on the consequences, the outcome of what it is that we do. So sub-theories like utilitarianism or pragmatism fall into that consequentialist framework. Again, just really simply, I look at or evaluate the consequences, the results of the action in order to evaluate it as right or wrong, good or bad. It's the dominant moral theory in the Western world, but it's not the only one. Sometimes when we evaluate a proposal, a conservation proposal, to stick to our theme here, what we really do is we appeal to some kind of a divine authority, or sometimes it's a divine authority and sometimes it's some other kind of authority. It's an external authority. So sometimes it is. It's, well, what did a divinity say? Or what does a sacred text say? It doesn't always look like that. Sometimes, and we know this is pretty prevalent in conservation, what we do is we appeal to what's called natural law theory. We say things like, well, we want to do that which is natural, or we want to restore something into its historic range of variation. We use synonyms for naturalness sometime. So any appeal to naturalness as a standard of good or bad, right or wrong, model of behavior, goal for conservation, is an appeal to an external authority, and that authority is our perception of naturalness. And then sometimes we just make appeals to human authorities, like maybe it's a famous conservation, right? What conservationist, what would John Muir do? What would Aldo Leopold do? Or it's, the Park Service policy is X, therefore we ought to, that's the right thing to do. All of those approaches, whether it's a divinity, a policy, or naturalness, are an appeal to external authority. And we do see some of that in conservation for sure. Not the only way to think about ethics either, because sometimes what we're really concerned with when we're trying to judge a policy or an action as right or wrong, good or bad, is we're concerned about the motives. Why did we do what we did? What were the motives behind our actions? So any kind of appeal to rights, respecting the rights of something that is a rights possessor, we decide as a rights possessor, that's a kind of motive appeal to justifying our actions. And any kind of appeal to virtues, what's called virtue theory, is also a motives kind of appeal, right? So if we say things like, well, what we should do is we should act, according to or in a way that is consistent with certain character traits like care and humility and respect. These are often virtues that get dredged up as really important. And the goal is to adhere our characters to those qualities. And that last one is where compassionate conservation fits. So right away, you can see it's not part of the dominant consequentialist ethical framework. It's really of what, until recently, was almost an invisible quality of ethical theory, but it's certainly a minority position. It's really an attempt to shift conservation away from consequentialism, away from external authority, and back toward appeals to virtue. It's the attempt to manifest the virtue of compassion, in this case, as a leading or the leading virtue that should drive conservation. And that's what would make conservation good. This is a new idea in conservation, but the reality is virtue theory is also a very, very old idea. In Western ethics, virtue theory was the cornerstone of Aristotle's idea about ethics. So for Aristotle, the ethical life is the life of practiced virtue. You have a set of virtues. They're typically the same ones: respect, care, courage, humility, empathy, love. And your goal as an ethical being is to practice those, is to get better at those, to bring those, adhere those to your character, make them part of your character, and bring those into the world more and more. So compassion is, the idea in compassionate conservation is that compassion is, some people would say, a right virtue to practice in conservation, and some people would say it's the right one. That's what it really should be focused on. So it is an attempt to reframe conservation around virtue ethics and away from predominantly utilitarian consequentialism. So I want to just mention some advantages and disadvantages of this approach. Some advantages include this whole idea that virtues can be practiced. You can get better at them. You can improve on these things. You can think, we can make compassion or some other virtue more a part of our approach or more a part of our policy. So there's some advantages to that. It's not just figuring something out. It's about an ethical practice. Another advantage to this that some people point out is that one of the challenges we have in conservation is that we want to include in our moral community both individual living things that we think of as important, and then also collectives of species, ecosystems, biotic communities, the land itself. But sometimes these things come into conflict with one another. But we want an ethical structure that embraces all of the things that we think are really important. And the interesting thing about compassion is that you can express compassion or be compassionate toward individual living things, but you can also be compassionate toward collectives. Those forms of compassion might very well look different, but you can include both of those things in your moral community and in your moral practice. And the other thing that happens here is that it democratizes conservation in really important ways, because anybody can practice compassion. It can show up in all forms of conservation in all places, and it can be practiced. It's going to look different in different places, which arguably is another form of the democratization of conservation. And it allows for everybody to participate. This is something that everybody can work on, is practicing compassion. I would ask you, these are only 3 advantages that I can see, that came to mind, but considering what I said about compassionate conservation or what you might already know, can you think of some other advantages? And I would invite you to have a conversation about these other advantages. Likewise, there are some challenges to this approach to conservation. For some people, it just doesn't seem practical. What do you mean we practice conservation? I need to know about what to do in a given situation. To tell me just to practice compassion isn't maybe that helpful. So for some people, it doesn't seem practical, and it doesn't seem practical because it certainly doesn't give us clear and immediate answers to what it is that we ought to do. For other people, they think that conservation should really be focused on science or reason, and they worry about anything that looks emotional. And I'm not suggesting that virtues and emotions are the same thing, but for some people, they would tend to conflate emotions with what I'm talking about when what I'm calling virtues, or especially the virtue of compassion. So they're nervous about that, right? It seems or feels emotional rather than rational and scientific. And another criticism could be that, why compassion? Why did you people focus on compassion? Why not some other virtue like empathy, like humility? Why compassion? So again, these are just 3 examples, and I would invite you to think about, in this case, maybe what are some more examples, but also how might you respond to those challenges? Are those actually good challenges or not? If somebody was actually offering those, are there things that you might say in response to those challenges? I want to make the point just generally that how we frame conservation in these kind of ethical, theoretical ways, it really matters. It's not just a kind of fickle preference. It really matters. And I tried to do that here with just a little table. And on the left, I tried to think about questions that we might ask in very kind of standard or typical Western utilitarian environmental structures and frameworks, and then how that question might look different, and the conversation that those different questions might necessitate, given a restructuring of those questions, that same question in a kind of virtue ethics, compassionate conservation reframing. So here I just gave you 3 examples, and I just want to pick one of them to read and focus on, and I'll pick number 2. So a very standard Western utilitarian environmental question and framing might look something like this. Should a non-native or overabundant species be culled if doing that maximizes overall ecosystem health? This should be a question that you recognize, yep, that's a conservation question. And some of you might be thinking, that's all we seem to talk about in conservation. And if that's what you think, you may have been through a number of these conversations in conservation that you find ultimately unsatisfying, that we don't seem to make any progress or be able to answer that question very, very clearly, even though the question seems really, really clear. If you took a virtue ethics approach to that question, I think you would ask or think about that question in different ways. You might ask this: how can we respond to this species in a way that avoids intentional harm, seeks coexistence, and reflects moral character, finding solutions that uphold compassion both for individual animals and also still foster ecological integrity? So you wouldn't necessarily think of them as in a kind of trade-off fashion, or a one thing's going to win, one thing's going to lose, which should it be and why? You're going to try to find, I think in this case, or start with trying to find a lot more about coexistence if you start with this concept of compassion. So again, the framing here seems to matter. It seems to affect our imaginations in really important ways. I was trying to think of another way to express this, and I was thinking about some of my colleagues, my indigenous colleagues, and the way they express conservation ethics. And I was just going to invite you to imagine these concepts. Imagine if you started with the assumption, and one of the important things in your worldview was this idea that the whole world was part of a community. And it was a community to which you belonged as well, that the world was a collection of all our relations. And that's what fundamentally it was. You were a member of a larger, biotic, living community. And imagine if, as a result of that, the way that you interact with the world, like the way that you interact with your family, is in a process of reciprocity. That you give your gifts, they give their gifts, you give in kind, you never take too much, you never ruin the gift, you always use it correctly, that there's a reciprocal relationship between things in a world where everything is related. And what if the ultimate goal of all of that is to be a good ancestor at the end of the day? And that all of these things are your relations. So the height of, or the weight of being a good ancestor is really quite tremendous. And your goal also is to find ways, therefore, to be in right relationship with the rest of that world and to manifest certain core virtues like humility. Inevitably, it manifests humility and care. Part of your job is to be a caretaker in a community like that and to act with honor and to live in a world of abundance and to bring abundance and not scarcity into existence. It's not about fighting over scarce resources. It's about nurturing abundance. I think you can zoom in on these qualities and you can see pretty clearly, like these are different. These are different than the dominant Western ways, not only that we think about the world, but I would say that we go about conservation as well. But what if it was different? What if you started with these assumptions? And again, I made a table, with 5 questions this time. On the left, Western ethical questions, and on the right, given what I just said on that last slide, an indigenous reframing of the same ethical question. So just take number 1, for instance. What's the right action for an individual to take in this situation? A very common way that we think, what should I do? Another way to think about that from an indigenous perspective is, how will my actions affect my relatives? With people, land, ancestors, and those yet to come? And what action best honors those relationships? Or number 2, a Western ethical question might be, do I have a right to use this resource? And do you have a right to use this resource? An indigenous way to reframe that might be, how can I engage with this resource in a way that respects its spirit, maintains balance, and upholds my responsibilities as a caretaker rather than an owner? So again, you can imagine different conversations, different ways of trying to think your way through this ethical question, given these different reframings, which are the result of the different assumptions that we might make. I think that one of the things that compassionate conservation does that is really important, and it's not just compassionate conservation, is that it helps us imagine things a little bit differently. And I want to sort of end by emphasizing what I think is the absolute critical role of imagination. And I chose this image intentionally. This is a tree that Bob Kiefer took a picture of after the Holiday Farm fire in 2020. And when I see this picture, I can't help but imagine the rest of the tree into existence, the tree parts that were burnt away. And to see the tree as whole, I have to imagine it into existence. And this photo, like I said, I can't help but to do it with this photo. To see the tree, I see the rest of the tree. And so I think this is really important, that a lot of the approaches that we have in conservation are, they're only part of the tree. And some would argue they're part of a tree that's pretty scorched as well. So how do we reimagine conservation, which requires us to engage our imagination in ways that we often don't do? This passage to me captures this sense very beautifully. I love this passage, and it's from Brian Andreas, and he writes, "In my dream, the angel shrugged and said, 'If we fail this time, it will be a failure of imagination.' And then she placed the world gently in the palm of my hand." And I think many of us feel this weight. We feel that the world has been gently, or sometimes not so gently, placed in the palm of our hand. And we need to find ways forward. We need to engage our imaginations. Again, I think compassionate conservation is a way to do that. And it's like I said, it's certainly not the only way to do it, but it is a way to reimagine an ethical relationship with the world. And I think we need resilience too. And I think imagination and resilience go hand in hand. I think the more imaginative we are, the more we practice that, the more resilient we are as well. We think of new ways. We don't get trapped in the same old ways to do things. And so I'm going to end with a poem. And I love this poem because to me it captures the image of resilience that I think is really important right now. And this is a poem called Forsythia. Some of you might recognize this plant, Forsythia, and it's from a poet from Ohio named Jarod Anderson. "As Forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is Forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It's not an age for stone towers. It's an age for stubborn flowers." Thank you.